Welcome to the Community Development Podcast, a podcast dedicated to community development practice and approaches, sharing our learning and connecting the workforce. My name is Russell. Welcome to another episode of the Community Development Podcast. This will be episode number 41, episode 40, just by way of a bit of housekeeping. We discussed the social value of community finance in Ireland. It was an episode, usually these episodes get recorded and they sit there unedited for a couple of months. This one sat edited for a couple of months while we were waiting just for some political kind of clearance and the corridors of power just to get their ducks all in a row before we were allowed to make that episode available, because it referred to some sort of strategies that have some government money in. So we recorded that back in February, and I was joined from County Meath in the Republic of Ireland by Donald Traynor, who's Chief Executive of Community Finance Ireland. And then in the north of Ireland, so part of the UK, from Omagh was Conor McGale from the Rose Regeneration Trust. Though the CFI works across the whole island of Ireland. And it was really fascinating just to hear a little bit more about the social value that they calculate of their investment portfolio. And a lot of the money that distribute goes into the sort of projects that I'm sure my guests I'm about to introduce will be very familiar with. Certainly the sort of projects I have worked a lot with in the last sort of 20, 25 years of my career. And it was really fascinating to see it from a different perspective, perhaps, than is usually the case. So that's available on SoundCloud or wherever else you get your podcasts. So speaking of guests, it's a very great pleasure to invite, for the first time for this podcast, but one of these guests and I have spoken previously on one of the podcasts I produced for the International Association for Community Development. So it's nice to be speaking to Paul Lachapelle again. How are you, Paul?
Very well. Thank you so much for the opportunity to chat.
We spoke, I'm trying to think, maybe 18 months ago. 18 months ago on one of those podcasts, because you were one of the contributors to the ICD's book about sort of international community development practice. We will touch on it a little bit more fully, I think, in the course of our conversation, because it's mentioned in the paper that we're going to be discussing. And those podcasts are available on the ICD Global's SoundCloud website. But where are you calling from, Paul?
I'm calling in from my home in Bozeman, Montana. Montana is located in the northwest of the United States, near the Rocky Mountains, and I'm looking out. It's a beautiful June day here. The grass is green, which we've had lots of precipitation, which we always appreciate, because we're always very worried about the pending fire season, which always makes us nervous. Come this time of the year through about September or October.
Well, it sounds a lot better than what I'm looking at, which is good old-fashioned Welsh rain in Cardiff, and it's been cold and grey and damp, which is a shame. But this side of the pond as well, we have Charlie McConnell. How are you, Charlie? Welcome to the podcast. Finally, we've talked about it long enough, I think.
Hello, Russell. Lovely to be talking to you, and to you as well, Paul.
And whereabouts are you calling from, Charlie?
Well, I'm calling from a cold London. London is somewhere in the mid-Atlantic these days, and we've had a really miserable spring, and I don't think summer's properly started yet. But anyway, I'm also calling from home, so looking forward to the debate we have today. And
I assuming this weather's moving from west to east, you're going to be getting a soak in later. If what I'm looking at is anything to go by. So, Paul, what do you do in Montana?
Well, I'm a professor at Montana State University. That's our public institution here in the state. I've been employed with the university for going on 18 years now. I'm a tenured full professor in the Department of Political Science. I started out my career in what we call the extension service. So I was extending and bringing the university resources out to the people of our state of Montana. That's about 1 million people across the fourth largest state in the United States. So I had quite a task, and my role here was primarily training local elected officials and board members on kind of democracy 101, how to hold a meeting, what our what we call our sunshine laws, open meetings laws, how to invite the public in to participate in municipal and county level governmental functions. And also worked on our Native American Indian reservations. We have 8 federally recognized Indian reservations, that Indian population making up about 7% of our population here in the state, and had a number of programs to reach our Native populations. And I've since moved to a campus teaching position where I'm teaching undergraduate and graduate students, mostly in the environmental policy realm. And my main focus, as of the last few years, has been trying to bring attention to climate change and the climate crisis for our students on campus, our citizens around the state, and to a broader audience. And that was really one of my main goals as a board member with the International Association for Community Development, and also as president. I took over as president for a 3-year term when Charlie stepped down, and really wanted to engage our IACD members on this broader issue of climate change and climate breakdown, among other issues, of course. So, in a nutshell, that's basically what I do here in Montana in my professional life. And in my personal life, my sweetheart is a Baroque violinist, and I have the great pleasure of listening to her play on her 300-year-old fiddle, and she travels around the state and around the country, and I'm able to attend a lot of her performances, and so it's always a great thrill to be able to listen to wonderful music in this beautiful landscape here in Montana.
And you mentioned the IACD, and you mentioned your predecessor as president, Charlie. Charlie, what do people need to know about you? I mean, you're more retired now, but if the retired people I know are anything to go by, they're busier now than when they were in work.
Hi. Well, I'm a sort of recidivist community activist and community developer. I've been involved in community development for 50 years, I hate to admit. So early 1970s, and I had a 40-year paid career in community development, and then a 10-year unpaid career in community development, partially of which being involved quite heavily with IACD. I was the person in 1999 that actually led to the establishment of IACD as we know it today. Previously, I'd been a range of jobs, head of community education and community development with the Scottish Government. I ran the Carnegie Foundation as its CEO. I was European Director of the Community Development Foundation. I've worked as a community development educator for about a decade, and right at the beginning of my career, I was involved as a community worker and in trying to link adult education with community development. So really quite a long career, but enjoyed it and still enjoy it very much indeed. It's given me great pleasure. I've met wonderfully inspiring community activists and fabulous people working in the field from all sorts of sectors and all sorts of disciplines. So yeah, it's been an enriching field to be in. As for hobbies, I remember when I spoke on I think some podcast or something with Paul a few years ago, and he was saying, I'm just looking out of my window, there's a black bear has just walked across the garden. Now and again, at the moment, we have 2 rabbits in the garden, which we're rabbit sitting for, and a cat, a ginger cat that sort of keeps control and watches out for foxes. But ours is a tiny little garden, but we live near a lot of beautiful commons. So these are community-owned spaces in the southwest of London, which we have a lot of, thank goodness. So I'm a great walker, and I like getting out. I like listening to podcasts, and I like hiking. That's me. Oh, with my partner too. I have a wonderful partner, Iris, who is from Ireland and works in social care.
And we're going to discuss sins and sinning today. It's a great title for a great paper. You and Charlie are co-authors of this paper. It came out in 2023, I think I'm right in saying. It's in the Journal of the Community Development Society. Maybe a quick plug for them and that journal if people aren't familiar with it.
Yes, absolutely. And I've been on the editorial board of the journal for a number of years. And so I've been very involved in reviewing papers and also serve as the editor of our special issue book series, where we turn special issues of the journal into hardcover books with new introductions or new content. But I heard about a call for papers for this particular special issue, and it was being put out by the journal editor, Craig Talmage, as well as one of his colleagues, Brian Ashdown. And the focus of this special issue is what they were referring to as the dark side of community development, the dark side of community development. And, I was really intrigued about this is because I think, and I think Charlie would agree that, critical perspective, introspection and discussion and debate are healthy for a discipline and for colleagues, and not to put each other down and not to create unnecessary conflict, but really to get into the weeds about, for example, some of the questions that the special issue was asking were as follows. They in the call for papers they asked that they said we want to turn to, quote, the many challenges in the field, and they posed the following questions, quote, what are we missing as a discipline? Where are we stagnating? Where are we not challenging the assumptions? And where must we build bridges between theory, practice, and education? And how do we strive against a, quote, dark side future? So these were some of the questions that they were posing as the editors of this special issue, and I was intrigued. And so their intent was a critique of the journal and the field. And what they said was pushing the narrative towards a more engaged and interactive community development field. And I thought, well, this is, I'd have many interactions with Charlie through the IACD. I found Charlie to be someone who's provocative in a very constructive way about our field, and I always appreciate that about our colleagues who are not afraid to ask the difficult questions. And I knew that Charlie would likely have a response and maybe have an interest in contributing to this darker side of an introspection of the darker side of community development. So I emailed him and asked him if he had any interest, but told him that I was on sabbatical at that time and incidentally was traveling through Europe. But I asked if he would be willing to take the lead on this article. And so maybe I'll turn it over to Charlie and just curious what your response is now after several years that we've had to reflect back on this.
I was going to say, I mean, you could have thrown a couple of black bears in amongst the pigeons, I suppose. But is it fair to say that you've taken an approach that is very much on throwing a cat amongst the pigeons, and certainly not a couple of bunny rabbits? Then put it that way. Is that fair?
Well, I think we both hope so. Definitely. I sometimes felt there's a sort of smugness in our field, and certainly groupthink. I've come across far too much of it. And I think over the years, certainly here in Britain, there's a sort of feeling, it's all the conservatives, it's the cuts. That's what's destroyed community development and community work. And in part, that's true. But we can't just say that, because there are some parts of the UK which have worked their way through this. Scotland is an example of that. It still has a strong infrastructure of policy and practice support, whereas in England it's collapsed. So I was often thinking, well, what's the difference? What was going on there? And then I was talking with other colleagues on IACD on what had happened in their part of the world. And it just got me thinking about, well, maybe we are undervalued and underinvested in because of our own sins, because we got things wrong as a field, as a profession. And unless we start to address those, whatever we call our field, it may not still in the future be called community development, I don't really mind, but whatever it is called, those principles, those approaches, that participative social justice approach, and unless we address some of these sins ourselves, we won't be able to engage more effectively with, frankly, the people that fund community development programs, whether from government, local authorities, from foundations, etc. Unless we have the language to engage with them, and unless they see a confidence in us and actually recognise that we as a field have got something to offer, then I think we're not round the table as much as we should be. So, to cut a long story short, we said, well, what are those sins? And let's have a go. And let's, obviously, it's tongue-in-cheek, but let's call it the 7 deadly sins of community development. And I think they are part of the darker side of community development, and they're self-inflicted.
And I thought what we might do is sort of meander our way through these. I will maybe challenge, push back maybe in one or two of them. A couple of them I wholeheartedly endorse. Is one I think you probably haven't even gone far enough for my liking. But it's life's rich tapestry, isn't it? And we'll hold a little bit back as well, because I'd encourage people obviously to seek the paper out. The first of these deadly sins, the darker side, so-called, of community development, you've called anti-expertism. Tell us a bit more about that.
Okay, well, I'll take the lead, and as Paul has said, he'll bring in the beef. This really goes back a long way in our field. It goes back to the early 70s, when Ivan Illich published a number of books critical of professions, saying they promote their own self-interest. They adopt a mystifying language at the cost of the people they're there to serve. And he pointed to people like doctors and lawyers, etc. But he actually wrote about development professionals as well. And my feeling then and ever since is that we started to doubt our professionalism, and we started to see ourselves as a vanguard of anti-professions. And I think quite a few in our field wanted to see ourselves as activists, even though we were being paid to do the job by a local authority, a voluntary organisation, a foundation or whatever. But we wanted to see ourselves as activists. I think in a way that particularly came through in some of the reports coming in from an action research programme in the 70s called the Community Development Projects Programme, CDPs. Those with a lot of grey hair will remember those in the UK. They were based on the war on poverty in America. And they had quite a hostility towards the notion of community development or community work as a profession. And I think that started to influence a lot of articles, a lot of writing in the Community Development Journal. I remember at the time quite a vociferous disagreement between people like David Thomas from Wales, who set up the Community Development Foundation. People may remember him, and was the author of Skills in Neighbourhood Work, and he was a strong believer in greater professionalism and the professions. And there was this sort of rabid attack on some of David's work, on Alan Twelvetrees in Wales, on my own work in Scotland. And I think what happened is that a lot of this anti-expert libertarianism fed into then the right-wing libertarianism from the 1980s onwards. Because if we ourselves are saying, well, we don't need development experts, then obviously the radical right would say, oh, yeah, we agree with you. We'll just give a little bit of money, or probably none, to disadvantaged community organisations. So there was a feeling for me, I think, where the libertarian left had met the libertarian right, and it gave them a rationale for disinvestment. I think this certainly came through. You've got an organisation very strong in England called the Association of Community Workers, and it was absolutely the most anti-profession. It was very, very weak, and it collapsed. In Scotland, we had our own association. There is still, it's changed its name, but it's still there, the Community Development Alliance and the Scottish Community Development Forum. Very well organised. There are fora for managers, forum for practitioners, and there's no sense of apprehension or fear about audit and accountability. We have a well-established professional validation and endorsement body that looks at all the degrees for people wanting to graduate to enter this field. Their work, the inquiry and the investigating into those reports is welcomed by the universities, and it has led to far higher professional standards. There's a strong commitment to continuing professional development so that we can all address the changing challenges that affect the communities that we work with. So whilst we're always minded certainly not to have mystifying language, which sadly I think a lot of our academics do have, and certainly not to be just promoting our own careers or whatever and professional vested interests, we do need to be professionals and we need to be well organised. And it was because my hypothesis is that where you're not well organised, you're vulnerable.
Paul, in the article mentions almost like a confluence of this anti-expertism in some of the anti-science rhetoric that perhaps people will be more familiar with in relation to things like COVID-19 and the pandemic. And is that something that you see on your side of the Atlantic?
Certainly, and living in the United States is going through this COVID situation, and also the political divisions that we've seen in our country growing in the last 8 years. There has been a real push, and I see this particularly in the environmental movement, dealing with climate change and climate information. And the disinformation that goes along with that, a real push at anti-establishment, anti-expert sentiment within certain sectors of the United States, and that's why this sin really resonated with me. And I've been doing work, and in fact just published a paper on what my co-authors and I are calling academic capture, the inability of academic institutions of higher education, to really function to their full capacity, to reach their true mission and goals, to serve the public trust, to be a fiduciary of content, particularly controversial content, whether it has to do with gun control or climate change or gender identity, any of these issues. And what I've noticed anecdotally and what I've seen in the literature is our colleagues in the field within community development and more broadly across academia, self-censoring and really taking this kind of anti-expert sentiment home. And this is one of the great concerns for me is the fact that folks that do have proficiency and professional have gone through professional development and would see themselves as qualified as expert, having expertise in certain fields, just not stepping up to the plate, as it were. The piece that really stuck out for me in this article that I just published is by an author named Honeycutt, and Honeycutt worked on a piece for a group called the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. FIRE is the acronym, and they're kind of a right-leaning libertarian organization based here in the United States, but they represent academics and students on the left or on the right who are dealing with issues of free speech or intimidation that relates to academic freedom. And what Honeycutt et al. Found, and I'm just looking at the piece that I just published. What they found was that a third of faculty from the sample in the United States, very large sample, random sample of tenured and untenured faculty, their sample of assorted disciplines that they self-censor out of concern over the responses of their staff, students, or administrators. And what the study found was that 91% are at least somewhat likely to self-censor on social media, in meetings, in presentations, or in publications. And they also felt that a significant portion of their sample, of the faculty they sampled, actually support punishing their colleagues in ways that can chill expression to create what they refer to as a spiral of silence. and what they've turned soft authoritarianism that are reinforced through formal and informal channels. And so I see this also within my the field of community development, within my colleagues, this kind of collegial space, where colleagues tend to self-censor and adopt this kind of anti-expertism sentiment that we describe in the paper.
I mean, it's interesting you should touch on that, Paul, because as I was reading the paper, I was thinking, well, I know there's a danger. I mean, it was the anniversary, wasn't it? 75th anniversary of the publication of Orwell's 1984 on the weekend, just a few days ago before recording this. And there was a sense, as I'm reading it, what's the end game here? Where is the dystopian kind of endpoint for this anti-expertism, this distrust in science? I suppose even if people just feel a little bit lost in amongst, and you touch on it, with things like the internet, just not knowing who or what to trust from day to day, from issue to issue, from publication to publication, outlet to outlet, message board to message board, Facebook group to Facebook group. Even if someone's, with the best will in the world, they're wanting to try to make sense and try to find knowledge and the pursuit of truth and understanding, it can just be a bit of a minefield just because of the sheer size of the internet. So, yeah, there is a danger that we can get a little bit fatalist about all of this as well, though. Are there any cracks of light? That's a phrase you use in the paper in a particular context. But are there any sort of cracks of light in this? What can we do about it?
Well, my view is don't agonise, organise. It's a good old dictum in our field. You just have to look where community development practice is still being funded, has influenced public policy, where there is investment in the training of professional community development practitioners. And I do want to draw a distinction between the community activist, the volunteer within the community, fantastic work, great that we have people doing that, and community development professionals. They're complementary, but they're not synonymous. I don't think it's right for anybody just to say I'm a community development practitioner. It's like somebody saying, well, I'm an architect or I'm a doctor, but have done no training in that field, no continuing professional development. I don't adhere to my profession's ethical values and ways of working. I haven't had all the skills and the skill and the knowledge and all that would come from professional training. So I think community development practitioners, they need to believe in themselves much more. We talk about this a bit later as another sin. But I do think, don't agonise, try and reorganise. As I say, there's been a collapse in some countries, but we're seeing a reconnection. And not to be embarrassed about the fact that, look, I've trained. Of course, we all have a lot to learn. We have a dialogue model in the way we practice with the communities that we work with. But I do have expertise as well. I do have knowledge. I've spent 3 or 4 years doing my qualifications in this field. I have a lot of practical expertise, and I do work on my continuing professional development, and I work with my colleagues in my association or fora or whatever that might be. So and those things help. They really do help. They help build your sense of confidence and identity as a practitioner. Also, take another example. When you're working in local authorities, how many times have you come across a reorganisation within a local government, a local council, and where the head of community development is somebody who's come from another department, another field, another profession, has absolutely no expertise whatsoever in community development, but they're given that senior management job. Now, would you accept that in a lot of other fields? I'm not sure you would. But it seems we're so sort of weak, and we sort of somehow go along with that, and we're just lucky for the morsels we get. It doesn't have to be like that. And there are countries where we have organised.
So the second sin, this one might put the cat amongst the pigeons if we haven't already, localism and self-help. And ABCD, as base community development, is under the spotlight a little bit in respect of this particular sin. Why have you picked that one?
A starting point for that is, some of the mantras in our field, think global but act local. Community means small, it means local, it means working where you're at, sourcing where you're at, building up community enterprise, all that sort of stuff, that any sustainable development approach has to be a local approach. Well, when you're tackling disadvantage, poverty, vulnerabilities, inequalities, discrimination, systemic racism or whatever in society, you don't just work locally. You build connections with others. It's part of a wider sort of movement. In some of the early days of British community development, and certainly in the States, community development programs were quite big, multi-million-pound investments looking at the regeneration and development of poor areas. I remember in Scotland we had an area-based approach. There were 114 areas in the region of Strathclyde, the city region of Strathclyde, that was severely deprived on all socio-economic indicators. That was where the positive discrimination would occur. That's where disciplines from a whole range of departments and working with the voluntary sector, the police, the health services, etc., would target in multidisciplinary teams in community development strategies, holistic, multidisciplinary community development strategies. So those were the larger scale. If you look at what community development corporations do on economic development, and they're now all over the world, but started in the US, some of these are big urban regeneration funding and finance initiatives. Now, a lot of that has been cut for some of the, as we know, around different countries of the world. So we've somehow withdrawn to localism and made a virtue of necessity, and this is where asset-based community development comes in. I'm always impressed by the evangelists in ABCD. They're the most positive Pollyanna people that I've ever come across, and I love that in people. I really do. It's a can-do, bottles half full. But do you know where they started? Because they criticised that positive discrimination approach, that state intervention approach. What's state intervention? It's money going into areas to regenerate and develop them. So they said, no, let's get back to muscular self-help at the local level, and let's strengthen and build on the strengths, the muscular strengths of our community. So for me, although there are proponents of ABCD who would acknowledge a structural and systemic inequalities and discrimination analysis of poverty and disadvantage, a lot of those advocates are frankly take a much more modest, liberal, localistic, small-scale approach. And I think that there's a danger, because that's been attractive to more conservative funders and like the World Bank or whatever, they've been quite attracted to the ABCD model because it's cheaper than actually getting a model where the state and local state working with partners help support disadvantaged and deprived communities. Is much, much cheaper intervention. It's somehow now seen ABCD as what community development is all about. So I think there are great weaknesses in that, because it's by and large not a redistributive. It's not a redistributive approach. It doesn't concern redistributive fiscal policies that can target wealth and financial investment from richer localities and richer people to poorer ones in cities and regions across various countries in the world and localities in different regions. So it's got a part to play, but my fear is that it's now become equated with what community development is all about, that essentially it's about voluntary community work and self-help.
I think what resonates with me with this sin is what we're witnessing, well, in many places around the world, and certainly here in the United States. We mentioned this about book bans in local communities. We talk about anti-immigrant local ordinances. We talk about violence on a local level from homophobic beliefs and acts. I think it goes back to that old saying about Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of people can change the world for the better, but they can also change the world for the worse. And we're seeing this, on a local level as well. The example of book bans is something that maybe my colleagues in Europe aren't dealing with, but it's been a very big issue here in the United States. And in fact, there's just been some recent studies by a group called PEN America. It's a free expression group, not unlike FIRE, the group that I just mentioned. But they're looking back in 2023 here in the United States, and they recorded over 4,000 instances of book bans across 23 of our our 50 states here in the United States. And those happen mostly at what we call the school district level. So it's very much of a local political jurisdiction. And school districts have tremendous, here in the United States, have tremendous ability to sway all kinds of decisions, from hiring to curriculum development and these kinds of things. But what's really interesting is that these book bans are often instigated by just a small number of people. And in fact, according to this report that I'm looking at now, the challenges came in Wisconsin, one of our states, from just one parent. And this one parent led to a temporary book ban of over 400 books in one school district. So while we can see that individuals can be responsible for great things, but there's also a pernicious side, or a dark side to this localism that we wanted to highlight.
It's that word dystopian again, isn't it? I mean, Ray Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451, would probably have something to say about the banning of books for sure. A third of these sins.
Oh, can I just say one thing, Russell, before we move? In all of these 7, there's a bright side as well as a dark side. Paul and I could have argued on the other side of the fence on a lot of these. There's often progressive change takes place at the local level. But what we're also saying is think wider than that. Coalition building, network building, partnerships between different countries, between different areas. It doesn't have to all be local. In your community development practice can act global as well as act local. It can think global as well as think local. We just want to really shed a bit of light on this. It's not the only progressive model around, and it can sometimes be very regressive. And as I say, actually anti the wider role of the state, for example, in city region strategies or those sorts of things I spoke about earlier.
So it's almost like a call to be agile then, is it, perhaps, around, local is fine, but global is also there available for us as well to try to aim at and try to operate at in terms of those coalition buildings and building and things.
Well, increasingly so. I'm getting on a bit, but I did a bit of work internationally in the 80s, mid-80s, after the Bhopal catastrophe. Do you remember that? The Union Carbide factory that blew up, and it ended up killing thousands of people in India and ruining tens of thousands for their life after, and the corporate company tried to get out of, paying out. There was a lot of community action locally to try and do something against the company, to try and get recompense. It took links and partnerships with community organisations in the same city as the headquarters of Union Carbide, working to organise shareholders and others. It took that partnership and link. This is why we need to understand the structural and systemic nature of a lot of the poverty that many people have around the world is connected. It is connected. The poverty and the disadvantage and the discrimination that people suffer in Wales or parts of Wales is probably the effect of similar things that are happening all over the place. And you can learn a lot by finding what people have done in different parts of the world and partnering with them, connecting with them.
No, for sure. Okay, so number 3 in these 7 deadly sins, an overemphasis upon social capital. And Robert Putnam and his 2001 book Bowling Alone gets a bit of a kick in the shins as well. This is the one I have a little bit of issue with, but I'll invite you to present your case. Why is this one of the sins?
Okay, we give more space for your to hit back. I was working in the Scottish government when this book came out as head of community education and community development. And obviously I'd worked my way up through the field. So I was one of the few civil servants that actually knew what I was talking about, I think. Sorry, that sounds terribly arrogant, but most civil servants are dilettantes. And this book comes out, and the permanent secretary in the government said, "Oh, you've all got to read this. It's absolutely fantastic," And it became a wave through policy in government, and it did in many other places. And I sort of read it, and I thought, what patronising stuff this is. Here they were saying that really Poor and disadvantaged people lived in problematic communities because they lacked social capital. And those communities that work, that are strong, have strong social capital. Now, almost all of Putnam's research was not looking in those sorts of communities. And I'm sure the listeners to this podcast who are involved in community work and development know that LGBTQ plus communities, black communities, poor working class communities over the centuries have had to organise. They know how to organise. They've had to set up their associations and networks and clubs and cooperatives and all, and self-help, to defend themselves often against discrimination or whatever. So to assume that all disadvantaged communities need is a good strong dose of social capital and good neighbourliness and strength of the social networks, it was patronising, because it was assuming here my fellow civil servants, none of whom had grown up in those sorts of poor communities, just somehow assumed that's what you give them. And it took off as an investment and a funding line. And so what I'm saying, I found it patronising. And you've got to look far more deeply into other aspects of capital that are missing from, of course, the breakdown in working class communities and in trade unions has been very damaging. We know that. The atomization of society has been very, very damaging. We know all of those things are challenging everyone, but there are other capitals that are vital to look at. So we do point at some of the other frameworks, and Paul knows about this more than I do, the 5 capitals framework. But really, at the end of the day, the sort of capital that poor and disadvantaged and vulnerable communities want is finance. That's the main one. The human capital, the other social capital, the other thing, cultural capital, that builds on that. But at the root of a lot of this, so I think there's an overemphasis on social capital. It's got its place, but it has an overemphasis in our literature and sometimes in our practice.
So my thinking on this, and I said I think this is probably one where I will sort of push back a little bit, is that I think there is an overemphasis on a simplistic understanding of what Putnam was trying to say. And I think you're right in terms of that aspect maybe of sort of, quote unquote, sort of middle America, and a sufficiently rigorous sort of class dimension to what he was writing about. And I think I think the weakest part for me was always a slight, almost a blind spot, dare I say, on communities of interest. And you just pointed to a couple there. I think he himself has sort of gone, has acknowledged that in the years since. It's interesting what you said about sort of civil servants, because I'm not sure that I ever encountered in my career in Wales anybody ever really referring to the book. So maybe it maybe cornered the market a bit more in Scotland than it did in Wales. I don't know. And obviously was very popular and a big seller in the United States. I think one of the things that I think is valuable, and you mentioned that the word trust a bit earlier. I think one of the things it is good at is framing, how trust is kind of built up and developed and retained in communities, because it can be easily lost as well, but can be retained in communities, and the different dimensions and the sort of the typology, if you like, of social capital that he talks about. And I think what he's done is given people relatively straightforward and I don't want to use the word simple. There's an apparatus there that I think other people have been able to build on and add things to, and I think there's been some useful work since that, and I think that's something I would say is a virtue of his social capital kind of theories. But I think he himself would go back, I think, and recognise that the communities of interest was weak, and I think he has done and has been sort of has overseen within academic circles some work in relation to that. I mean, I think of Eric Klinenberg talking about some of the quite disadvantaged communities. I think, by my understanding, primarily black communities in Chicago in the heat wave of 95, 96, I think it was, mid 90s anyway. And what are the factors between very similar demographically speaking communities? Why were death rates so much higher in one area than the other? So I think there is something in it, and I think maybe the issue is about not understanding what Putnam was saying enough, and rather than it in itself being simplistic, its application perhaps has been. I don't know. That would be my thing. I think as well the whole he did seem to single out TV for particular criticism, and so I think it's very reluctant actually, and talk about social capital a bit in other work I'm involved in, reluctant to talk about kind of more or less rising, falling, increasing, decreasing levels of social capital. It's more nuanced and it can take different forms and it can evolve, and I think that's one of the lessons I think of the last sort of few years, is that it's not this kind of binary, there's more of it or there's less of it, and holding up some sort of social capital gauge in the middle of the high street or the middle of the community to work out in which direction it's heading now. When Bowling Alone came out, there was no such thing as Facebook. And the ability of Facebook to allow people to keep in touch with one another and to know what's going on in people's lives. I think if you'd have held on maybe for another 5 or 6 years, I wonder whether maybe there'd been a slightly different text, because the internet would have grown exponentially just in that short period of time. But yeah, I'm always mindful, Paul, when people this side of the pond are talking about social capital and Putnam and Bowling Alone. My friend talks about skittling alone and the decline of skittling alleys in pubs and clubs of the UK and working class communities, and I think there's something in that. Is it just us limeys misreading it a little bit?
I think this is, this was the whole point of the article, was to elicit this, this intense discussion and debate about these terms that we kind of throw around or take for granted. And, maybe to get on the Putnam punching bag ride here, a lot of the critique about Putnam also was just the proxy measures of trust. Trust is one of these very ephemeral concepts like love or happiness that are just very difficult to put numbers on and to understand. Although we do have the World Happiness Index, and we make attempts to understand them. But again, I think what Charlie and I were attempting to say was that social capital is important, but is it the most important? Is something that needs to be highlighted above the other community capitals? Charlie referenced this framework that has been discussed by some of my colleagues, Cornelia Flora and her husband Jan. They've written a book called Rural Communities, and they introduced what was 5 community capitals, and it's evolved into 7 community capitals. And I had the good pleasure of sitting down with that author, Cornelia, several years ago and asking her point blank, what do you think is the most important capital, or which capital kind of undergirds the other capitals? And she thought for a while, and I'll just tell you what these capitals we've talked about: social capital, but there's also human capital, there's political capital, there's cultural capital, and those tend to be more on the the soft sciences related to the social sciences, and then we also have natural capital, financial capital, and built capital. So those kind of outline the 7 areas, and Cornelia said that there's a number of others that have been discussed and considered. But when I asked her, which of these capitals would you feel is underemphasized, and that we don't tend to, or that we need to kind of consider in our community development work? She thought about this for a while, and she came back and she felt. She said that cultural capital was something that was really underemphasized in our community development work. A cultural capital having to do with the traditions that we hold, the rituals that we undertake, the language that we speak, and the traditions that we have, and the celebrations, etc. And these are the kinds of things, particularly in the United States, that tend to be homogenized and really looked down upon. There's a real kind of anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, and we've seen that certainly in some states with the scrutiny about critical race theory, and the fact that we shouldn't be emphasizing certain cultures over others. Celebrating diversity is frowned upon in some school districts. So I find it interesting that, again, and I was intrigued by this sin as well, that we tend to overemphasize social capital. And again, I think that's at the expense of the other capitals that Flora et al. And others have talked about.
So that's part one of the 7 deadly sins of community development with Paul Lachapelle and Charlie McConnell. Part 2 will be along in a moment. Please check out the Patreon where you can support the podcast at www.patreon.com/the CD podcast. And please like us and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform that you use. Thank you.